Let's talk about the American dream. It's a topic that's come up a lot recently, and I think as a millennial that a lot of people talk about it essentially to dunk on it and to say that it's dead. Um, I would argue that it is dead, but there's a reason for it, and I think that it's very misunderstood. My name is Patrick. I am a genealogist. I help people obtain citizenship by descent. That is the citizenship of their ancestors who naturalized or immigrated to the United States. So family history and the perspectives of our ancestors is something I care a lot about. But I think people forget the context of history, and that's the foundation of the American dream. And I'd like to start off here with an analogy. I had a history professor who would always ask his class, how in the world did they write in prohibition into the Constitution? They outlawed alcohol in the Constitution. Think about how difficult that would be to do today, and they did it 100 years ago, and they did it in a way in which it passed multiple states and was able to be written in the Constitution. How did that happen? And people say, I don't know, it's history. But the reality is that history is best understood in the context of the time. And so at the time in which they passed prohibition, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment because of World War I. There was also the burgeoning temperance movement, which coincided with the rights of women and their right to vote. And so there was a lot of political agreement that this was a positive and a progressive cause. I use that word in the historical sense of the word, not in the modern day sense of the word. And so think about that. It was the context of history that helps you understand why things happened, right? Now shift to the American dream. Think about the generation of Americans who built the country after the Civil War up through roughly the 1900s. Most of them worked with their hands. Most of them were farmers. Those that didn't farm, the rest were generally self-employed. They sold wares. They worked with their hands. They were artisans. They were stonecutters. They were blacksmiths. They were people that didn't depend on someone else for a paycheck because there wasn't a lot of incredibly structured business. If they worked for someone else, it was for an inn, it was for a bar, it was for a service where there was a couple employees and you were paid sometimes formally, sometimes not formally. That generation then gave rise to the generation that ultimately went off to World War I. That generation saw industrialization. They saw the organization of labor, and they saw essentially the Industrial Revolution. But it was disrupted not only by things like the advent of the automobile or the destruction of World War I, which the American mind doesn't really remember, but that was significant. And it was only the generation after that, the generation, the greatest generation, that grew up, served in World War II, saw the destruction of war, and then came back to the United States. The industrial complex was significant. It was the only one that survived the war, something that people talk about a lot today. And so suddenly you could have a desk job. You could be an accountant. You could be a lawyer. You could be a salesman. You could sell quality term life insurance. You could sell aluminum siding. And for the first time, there was not the looming destruction of war. The Cold War existed, but it wasn't quite at its peak like it was in the 60s. The Cold War was there, but life was good. You could collect a paycheck. You didn't have to work for it with your hands. You could work for someone else in a respectable, very well compensated way, such to the extent that you could raise a family on that. And that was the first time in history that had truly happened. And for most people, their concept of history only goes back 2 generations, because the oldest people that they know are their grandparents' generation, and they know those stories. And so if you're a millennial like me, you might know a story about the Great Depression because a grandparent experienced that. But beyond that is a black box in history. Think about that for your grandparents' generation. They knew their grandparents, the ones that worked for themselves and worked with their hands. They were the ones that came up through the industrialization of America. They were the ones who were, the gritty immigrants who got the job done. Those people saw America as an opportunity, but they had to work really hard. They had to make something of themselves. The greatest generation, the one that saw the destruction of war in World War II, but then came home and had a great life, that was the American dream. That was the dream to them. And so I bring all of this up because what I just described is not replicable today. And frankly, it wasn't replicable before World War II. We talk about the American dream because it was the greatest time for a generation. And it was one that they sang praises to, but it doesn't mean that it's going to continue indefinitely. And I would argue that it has not. Has it continued for the baby boomers? Yes, of course. And there's historical reasons for that. The historical reasons for that were the end of the Cold War, combined with the fact that they never saw conflict outside of those who served in Vietnam or the Korean War, but that's a different generation. And so I bring all of this up because there's all this chatter about the American dream. But I think the context of history about what the American dream was, why it existed, and why it existed at one point in time is lost. The American dream has not always been here. It did exist at a certain point in time, and the factors that contributed to it at that time, I would argue, don't exist today. And so, a little food for thought. Completely different than what I usually talk about. If you have, completely unrelated, if you want to talk about citizenship by descent or the immigration story of your ancestors, I'm a genealogist. Feel free to reach out and book a call, but I thought that this was a little bit more of a interesting listening topic for now. And as always, we try to make history an opportunity. We'll see you next time. Cheers.